In the spring of 1348, a merchant ship drifted into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The crew aboard were either dead or dying. Those still breathing bore swellings the size of apples beneath their arms and in their groins, their skin blackened with subcutaneous hemorrhages that looked like Satan's fingerprints. The air around them carried a stench so putrid that dockworkers vomited at the mooring lines. Within days, the same symptoms appeared in the city. Within weeks, thousands were dead. No one understood what was happening. No one could stop it. And no one, not the physicians, not the priests, not the kings, could save them. This is the story of what it was like to live through humanity's darkest hour, when between 75 and 200 million people, nearly half of Europe's population, would perish in just 7 years. When the boundary between the living and the dead became so thin that survivors couldn't tell which side they belonged to anymore. This is what life was like during the Black Plague.
The arrival. Bodies began appearing in the streets before anyone understood there was a plague at all. The disease moved with the efficiency of a predator. It traveled along trade routes, hiding in the fur of black rats, living in the guts of fleas no bigger than a poppy seed. The bacterium Yersinia pestis had evolved over millennia to be the perfect killer, and medieval Europe, with its dense cities, poor sanitation, and constant commerce, was the perfect killing ground. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. The ships had come from the Black Sea, from the besieged city of Kaffa, where Mongol forces had catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls in one of history's first acts of biological warfare. The merchants who survived the voyage brought more than silk and spices, they brought death itself. At first, it seemed like other illnesses people had weathered before. A man would wake with a fever. By afternoon, he'd develop a headache, chills, a bone-deep exhaustion. But then came the buboes, grotesque swellings of the lymph nodes that gave the disease its name. These egg-sized lumps appeared in the armpits, neck, and groin, hot to the touch, agonizing beyond description. The victim's tongue would turn white. Their breath would become rancid. Dark spots would bloom across their skin like poisonous flowers. And then, within 3 to 5 days, they would be dead. The speed was what terrified people most. A man could be laughing with his family at breakfast and convulsing in his own waist by supper. A woman could kiss her children goodnight and be a corpse by dawn. There was no warning, no mercy, no time to prepare. Physicians were baffled. The medical knowledge of the day, based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, offered no explanation and no cure. Doctors believed the plague was caused by miasma, corrupt air arising from earthquakes, planetary alignments, or God's wrath. They prescribed bloodletting, which only weakened patients further. They recommended poultices of lily root and dried toad. They wore long, beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing the sweet smells would protect them from the poisoned air. Nothing worked. By the winter of 1348, the plague had crossed the Alps into France. By spring, it had reached Paris. By summer, it engulfed England, and everywhere it went, the same pattern repeated: disbelief, then recognition, then horror, then death, on a scale no one alive had ever witnessed. People began to understand that something was fundamentally wrong when entire families vanished overnight, when neighbors who had been healthy the day before were found dead in their beds, black blood crusted around their mouths, when the bells that had always rung for individual deaths began tolling constantly until the bell ringers themselves fell ill and the bells went silent altogether. That silence, that terrible, unprecedented silence, was how most people first realized the world was ending.
The daily horrors. In Florence, the dead outnumbered the living so drastically that bodies were stacked in layers in mass graves, like lasagna, each layer sprinkled with lime. The plague transformed every aspect of existence into a waking nightmare. Morning began with death carts making rounds, drivers calling, "Bring out your dead!" in voices hoarse from breathing through vinegar-soaked cloths. Streets became rivers of filth and fear. Garbage rotted. Dogs and pigs feasted on corpses left for days. The stench, decay, burning sulfur, funeral pyres was inescapable. People moved like ghosts, faces covered, eyes hollow, avoiding all contact. Inside homes, families barricaded themselves, sealing windows with vinegar-soaked rags, burning juniper to purify air. But plague respected no barriers. It crept through keyholes, carried by rats nesting in walls. Because plague was believed contagious, families faced an impossible choice: abandon their sick or risk infection. Love and survival became opposing forces. Boccaccio wrote that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister left brother, and very often wife abandoned husband. Fathers and mothers refused to tend their children. Those who fell ill experienced unimaginable suffering. Buboes grew to orange size, turning purple-black as tissue died. The pneumonic form filled lungs with bloody fluid. Victims literally drowned in their own bodies, coughing red froth, faces blue. The septicemic form turned skin black from hemorrhaging, extremities gangrenous while victims still lived, delirious and screaming at invisible horrors. Medical care was worse than useless. Barber surgeons lanced buboes with filthy blades. They prescribed drinking liquid gold, eating crushed emeralds, bathing in urine. One treatment involved strapping a live chicken to buboes, believing it would draw out poison. The chicken died. So did the patient. Food became scarce as farmers died in fields. Survivors subsisted on salted fish, hard bread, turning wine. Meals were eaten in silence, each praying they wouldn't be next. At night, cities glowed with cremation fires. Smoke blotted out stars. Those trying to sleep heard the sounds that would haunt them forever. Death carts rattling over cobblestones, the wailing of the bereaved, desperate prayers, and underneath it all, the buzz of flies feasting on the dead. This was daily life, not one terrible day, but months into years, where each morning brought fresh horror, and each night offered no promise of dawn. The reactions.
When medicine failed, people turned to God, and when God seemed not to answer, they turned on each other. The plague shattered medieval understanding. The church taught that God was benevolent, righteousness rewarded. But plague killed indiscriminately. Pious monks died alongside prostitutes, innocent children alongside criminals. This created a faith crisis. If God allowed this, it must be punishment. But for what sin? The answer had to be enormous, requiring drastic penance. Enter the flagellants. These religious zealots traveled town to town, stripped to the waist, whipping themselves with iron-spiked scourges, backs torn bloody. They believed 33 days of flagellation, one for each year of Christ's life, would earn forgiveness. They sang hymns as blood ran down their legs. Towns initially welcomed them as holy intercessors, but flagellants grew radical, attacking Jews, desecrating churches, declaring themselves holier than priests. The Pope condemned them, but damage was done. Because when people couldn't understand plague, they needed someone to blame. They blamed the Jews. Accusations spread that Jews had poisoned wells to destroy Christians. The charges were absurd. Jews died at the same rates, but fear doesn't require logic. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive on Valentine's Day, 1349. In Mainz, 6,000 murdered. Entire communities were annihilated. Others sought different salvation. Some believed corrupted air was the cause, tried purifying it by burning herbs, ringing bells constantly, firing cannons. Some believed bathing would open pores to infection and didn't wash for months, ironically making them more likely to host plague-carrying fleas. The wealthy fled to countryside estates. It rarely helped. Rats came in their baggage. Some abandoned moral restraint. Boccaccio described Florentines drinking heavily, enjoying life, going about singing and satisfying their appetites in every possible way. They broke into abandoned homes, held orgies in houses of the dead, lived each day as their last. Others withdrew completely, living in isolation, refusing to acknowledge what was happening. Their minds couldn't process the catastrophe's scale. The church struggled to maintain authority. Priests died in droves. Those remaining often charged exorbitant fees for final rites. This naked greed, combined with obvious inability to stop plague, planted seeds that would bloom into Protestant Reformation. Astrologers blamed planetary conjunctions. Physicians blamed earthquakes releasing poisonous vapors. Some believed it was Revelation's end times, that the four horsemen were riding. No one had the answer, and in that void, fear metastasized into madness.
The breakdown. In Siena, construction on the magnificent cathedral stopped mid-project when so many workers died that no one remained who remembered the original plans. The plague didn't just kill people, it destroyed civilization's machinery. Trade networks collapsed, banking systems failed, as creditors and debtors died, records lost. Entire professions vanished. Agriculture suffered catastrophic losses. Fields went unplowed, harvests rotted, livestock wandered untended through abandoned villages. Food prices skyrocketed while demand plummeted, so few left to eat. Labor became the most valuable commodity. Surviving workers demanded wages 5 times previous rates. Peasants bound to the land for generations simply walked away. This sudden power shift sent shockwaves through feudalism that would contribute to its collapse. Chronicler Jean de Venette wrote of priests refusing confessions for fear of infection, leaving people to die unshriven, souls damned by cowardice. Children orphaned by the dozen wandered calling for parents who would never answer. Houses were sealed with sick inside, left to die of thirst even if plague didn't take them. Trust evaporated. Neighbors refused to help each other. Cities closed gates to refugees. Venice instituted the first quarantine, 40 days isolation for ships, but even this couldn't stop spread. Cities became ghost towns. Wolves were spotted in streets. Vegetation reclaimed buildings. In England, over 1,000 villages were abandoned and never resettled. The psychological damage was immeasurable. Survivors had watched everyone they loved die. They lived with what we'd now call severe PTSD, unable to form relationships, plagued by nightmares. A generation grew up knowing only death. Children who survived had no parents, no stability, no reason to trust tomorrow would come. They became hard-hearted, unable to express normal emotion because they'd been forced to suppress it. This was the true legacy, not just deaths, but destruction of social fabric that made life worth living. When the plague finally retreated in 1353, it left behind a Europe that would never again resemble what it had been. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people. In Europe alone, 30% to 60% of the population died. Some cities lost 80%. Entire bloodlines were extinguished. Languages disappeared when last speakers perished. The Black Death was the nightmare that Europe barely survived. But survive it did. And in surviving, it proved something essential about humanity.
that we are at our most remarkable not when things are easy, but when they seem impossible. That we are defined not by the disasters that befall us, but by what we become after we've endured them. The plague killed half of Europe, but it couldn't kill the human spirit. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.